for I was particularly interested in the account I once read of it, and I remember the description well. I am sorry, however, that I have forgotten the descriptions of many other trees, which I am sure we have seen to-day, if we could but recognize them. So you see, Peterkin, I'm not up to everything yet." "Never mind, Jack," said Peterkin with a grave, patronizing expression of countenance, patting his tall companion on the shoulder. "Never mind, Jack. You know a good deal for your age. You're a clever boy, sir, a promising young man; and if you only go on as you have begun, sir, you will " The end of this speech was suddenly cut short by Jack tripping up Peterkin's heels and tumbling him into a mass of thick shrubs, where, finding himself comfortable, he lay still, basking in the sunshine, while Jack and I examined the breadfruit tree. We were struck with the deep, rich green colour of its broad leaves, which were 12 or 18 inches long, deeply indented, and of a glossy smoothness, like the laurel. The fruit with which it was loaded was nearly round, and appeared to be about 6 inches in diameter, with a rough rind, marked with lozenge-shaped divisions. It was of various colours, from light pea green to brown and rich yellow. Jack said that the yellow was the ripe fruit. We afterwards found that most of the fruit trees on the island were evergreens, and that we might, when we wished, pluck the bosom and the ripe fruit from the same tree. Such a wonderful difference from the trees of our own country surprised us not a little. The bark of the tree was rough and light coloured. The trunk was about 2 feet in diameter, and it appeared to be 20 feet high, being quite destitute of branches up to that height, where it branched off into a beautiful and umbrageous head. We noticed that the fruit hung in clusters of 2s and 3s on the branches, but as we were anxious to get to the top of the hill, we refrained from attempting to pluck any at that time. Our hearts were now very much cheered by our good fortune, and it was with light and active steps that we clambered up the steep sides of the hill. On reaching the summit, a new and, if possible, a grander prospect met our gaze. We found that this was not the highest part of the island, but that another hill lay beyond, with a wide valley between it and the one on which we stood. This valley, like the first, was also full of rich trees, some dark and some light green, some heavy and thick in foliage, and others light, feathery, and graceful, while the beautiful blossoms of many of them threw a sort of rainbow tint over all, and gave to the valley the appearance of a garden of flowers. Among these we recognized many of the breadfruit trees, laden with yellow fruit, and also a great many cocoa nut palms. After gazing our fill, we pushed down the hillside, crossed the valley, and soon began to ascend the second mountain. It was clothed with trees nearly to the top, but the summit was bare, and in some places broken. While on our way up, we came to an object which filled us with much interest. This was the stump of a tree that had evidently been cut down with an axe. So then, we were not the first who had viewed this beautiful isle. The hand of man had been at work there before us. It now began to recur to us again that perhaps the island was inhabited, although we had not seen any traces of man until now. But a second glance at the stump convinced us that we had not more reason to think so now than formerly, for the surface of the wood was quite decayed, and partly covered with fungus and green matter, so that it must have been cut many years ago. "Perhaps," said Peterkin, "some ship or other has touched here long ago for wood, and only taken one tree." We did not think this likely, however, because in such circumstances the crew of a ship would cut wood of small size and near the shore, whereas this was a large tree and stood near the top of the mountain. In fact, it was the highest large tree on the mountain, all above it being wood of very recent growth. "I can't understand it," said Jack, scratching the surface of the stump with his axe. "I can only suppose that the savages have been here, and cut it for some purpose known only to themselves. But hallo! What have we here?" As he spoke, Jack began carefully to scrape away the moss and fungus from the stump, and soon laid bare 3 distinct traces of marks, as if some inscription or initials had been cut thereon. But although the traces were distinct, beyond all doubt, the exact form of the letters could not be made out. Jack thought they looked like JS, but we could not be certain. They had apparently been carelessly cut, and long exposure to the weather had so broken them up that we could not make out what they were. We were exceedingly perplexed at this discovery, and stayed a long time at the place, conjecturing what these marks could have been, but without avail. So, as the day was advancing, we left it, and quickly reached the top of the mountain. We found this to be the highest point of the island, and from it we saw our kingdom lying, as it were, like a map around us. As I have always thought it impossible to get a thing properly into one's understanding without comprehending it, I shall beg the reader's patience for a little while I describe our island thus shortly. It consisted of 2 mountains, the one we guessed at 500 feet, the other, on which we stood, at 1,000. Between these lay a rich, beautiful valley, as already said. This valley crossed the island from one end to the other, being high in the middle and sloping on each side towards the sea. The large mountain sloped, on the side farthest from where we had been wrecked, gradually towards the sea; but although, when viewed at a glance, it had thus a regular sloping appearance, a more careful observation showed that it was broken up into a multitude of very small vales, or rather dells and glens, intermingled with little rugged spots and small but abrupt precipices here and there, with rivulets tumbling over their edges and wandering down the slopes in little white streams, sometimes glistening among the broad leaves of the breadfruit and cocoa-nut trees, or hiding altogether beneath the rich underwood. At the base of this mountain lay a narrow bright green plain or meadow, which terminated abruptly at the shore. On the other side of the island whence we had come stood the smaller hill, at the foot of which diverged 3 valleys, one being that which we had ascended, with a smaller vale on each side of it, and separated from it by the 2 ridges before mentioned. In these smaller valleys there were no streams, but they were clothed with the same luxuriant vegetation. The diameter of the island seemed to be about 10 miles, and as it was almost circular in form, its circumference must have been 30 miles, perhaps a little more, if allowance be made for the numerous bays and indentations of the shore. The entire island was belted by a beach of pure white sand, on which laved the gentle ripples of the lagoon. We now also observed that the coral reef completely encircled the island, but it varied its distance from it here and there, in some places being a mile from the beach, in others a few hundred yards, but the average distance was half a mile. The reef lay very low, and the spray of the surf broke quite over it in many places. This surf never ceased its roar, for however calm the weather might be, there was always a gentle swaying motion in the great Pacific, which, although scarce noticeable out at sea, reaches the shore at last in a huge billow. The water within the lagoon, as before said, was perfectly still. There were 3 narrow openings in the reef, one opposite each end of the valley which I have described as crossing the island, the other opposite our own valley, which we afterwards named the Valley of the Wreck. At each of these openings the reef rose into 2 small green islets, covered with bushes, and having 1 or 2 cocoa-nut palms on each. These islets were very singular, and appeared as